Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Wharfdale Naturalist Society. I thought perhaps before I introduce tonight's speaker, I ought to say something about my alarming appearance. I'm very sorry to be appearing in front of you all in such terrible state. Unfortunately, I had a nasty cycling accident a couple of nights ago where my front wheel got stuck in a tram track and the bike stopped, and sadly I didn't stop. And so this is the result. So I apologise for looking so dreadful, but hopefully I will be able to manage tonight without too much trouble. As long as there's no cycling involved, I think I'm happy. So I think it's probably wise just to go through the procedure for. I guess there may still be people who've never been to one of these webinars before, so you need to know what will happen. I'll introduce the speaker very shortly, then we'll have the talk. I just want to let you all know that what we do for Q&A is ask people as the talk's going on to put their questions in the Q&A as their questions occur to them, which will enable Jeff to put them in a logical order to ask to Jack at the end of things. So they're to go in the Q&A, please, which there should be a button at the bottom of your screen if you're not very familiar with this Zoom webinar platform. Okay, well, I think tonight is undoubtedly one of the highlights of the winter programme. I'm very excited about it. We are very lucky to have Jack Lucas here with us. Jack is an experienced professional marine ecologist. He's got a wide range of field skills, a lot of scientific knowledge. He has a particular focus on marine mammals and seabirds. He's travelled all over the world researching these animals and birds, and has amassed a great deal of experience and knowledge as a result of his travels. I think I'm right in saying he's a bit of a specialist on the west coast of Scotland. I think I've gleaned from one of his online appearances that he was formerly a senior tutor at the Field Studies Council in Millport, which I had to look up, but I've realised it's on a very small island close to the Isle of Bute. Is that right? I can't quite remember the name of the island itself, but it looked like an astonishing place to have spent a lot of time. And for the last few years, he's been offering wildlife courses for the Field Studies Council. I'm sure many of you here tonight will have been on Field Studies Council courses and will know how marvellous they can be. So without further ado, I should let you know that the title of tonight's talk is Charismatic Marine Megafauna of the UK. And over to you, Jack.
Thanks very much, Helen. That was a lovely introduction. Maybe one of the nicest ones I've had. Hi everybody. Thank you for coming along. Thank you so much for having me. Before I crack on, I'll just make sure that everybody can hear me and share and that you can see my screen. So
that's perfect, Jack. Yeah.
Thank you. Perfect. I can't see you now, so I was hoping someone would crop up and tell me. So am I all good to go? You can see me and hear me.
Correct. On you go.
Fantastic. So yeah, thank you so much for coming along. My name's Jack. As Helen said, I've kind of got a bit of a mixed background in seabirds and marine mammals. Formerly, I work for the Field Studies Council. I still do moonlight as a tutor. I teach field courses and online courses. But actually, my day job for the last couple of years has been providing scientific advice to the Scottish Government. So I work for Marine Scotland, or the Marine Directorate of the Scottish Government. And my day-to-day role is providing scientific advice on the impacts of things like offshore renewables and fisheries on marine mammals and seabirds. So I guess that's my day job, but this is something I really like to do on the side. I've amassed so many lectures and field courses over the years with the Field Studies Council. It's nice to come along to a different venue. So thank you so much for having me. The title of tonight's talk is Charismatic Marine Megafauna, which is pretty broad. There's a bunch of stuff that I could talk about. There's so many interesting species, but we'll see what I can get into time And yeah, I can take any of your questions at the end. So let's see if we can move on to the next one. Yeah. So a brief breakdown of what I'm going to talk about today. So why is the UK important? Why is the UK good for looking for some cool marine species? What sort of things do we have? So I'll talk over some case studies of some of the I say more interesting species. That's relative, but you can decide. What threats do they face? So what conservation issues are quite important at the moment? Why are the species themselves important, to the ecosystem, to science? And then I'll try and finish off at the end by saying how you can get involved with seeing more of these animals in their natural habitat. So some tips about how you can get a bit more face time with some of these cool animals. So the UK is one of the best. I mean, hopefully, well, I think all of you guys are based in the UK, given the location of your society. But it really is one of the best places in the world to see marine wildlife, to see charismatic marine megafauna. And we've got a huge coastline. We've got tens of thousands of miles of coastline, and our the EEZ, or the Exclusive Economic Zone, what counts as UK waters, and we've got 1.25 million square miles of ocean. So there's a lot of sea, there's a lot of animals in it, and it's a really good place to go and find them. And within this 1.25 million square miles, we've got a huge variety of habitats as well. So loads and loads of different environments that you can go that will have different species. And importantly for marine megafauna, and I'll talk over what I mean by that in a minute, we're really close to some important ocean currents, mainly that kind of curve up the west coast of the UK, and that brings all sorts of nutrients, but it also brings lots of species that might migrate to our shores for the summer or winter. So I guess megafauna is anything that's a large animal, and lots of people have different definitions. We're talking anything larger than kind of about that big. So there's lots of things I could talk about, but typically people tend to focus on seabirds, marine mammals, and then things like large fish and sharks and rays. So these are some of the animals that I'm going to be talking about. I mean, technically anything bigger than that lives in the sea is megafauna, and whether it's charismatic or not is probably open to opinion. But these are some of the species I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to have a section on seabirds, a section on marine mammals, and then I'll finish with a couple of fish. Got to throw some fish in there. So for seabirds are one of my specialties. So I teach a couple of courses each year for Field Studies Council on seabirds. They are some of the most amazing animals that you could possibly encounter. The life history strategies that they have, so the techniques of acquiring resources and then spending those resources is really quite remarkable, and they're so different to terrestrial birds. So they have this whole suite of specialist adaptations that I'll go through later, and many of them are specific to each species, but some things that seabirds have in common that make them quite different to terrestrial birds. Firstly, they have an incredibly long lifespan. So some birds can live up to 50-60 years. Getting on for kind of for mammal, large mammal type lifespans. A lot of them delay their breeding, so they have this thing called deferred maturity. So rather than being a songbird in your garden can after it's born, probably the next year or maybe the year after, it will start breeding. Seabirds will delay this for up to 10 years. They'll make sure they get into really good body condition, because it's quite difficult rearing chicks in some of these inhospitable places. They tend to only have one egg, so a really small clutch size. Your garden blackbird might have half a dozen or a dozen eggs in 1 year. Seabirds tend to only lay one egg per year, so it only gives them one chance. And again, compared to terrestrial birds, they'll look after their chicks for a long time as well. So some of the parenting periods can go up to 6 months for some species. So you get really quite different to the birds that you'll see in your garden. And just to illustrate this, I won't spend too long on this, but you can compare some of the data on seabirds versus small birds, and you can see there that the lifespan, the clutch size, the period they incubate their eggs for, how long they look after their chicks post fledging, is dramatically different to their terrestrial counterparts. So if there's a takeaway from the general seabird information, is that seabirds live longer, they mature later, they have less young than terrestrial birds, but they invest more energy per offspring. And as a result of this, that chick is way more likely to succeed and make it onto adulthood versus terrestrial birds, where the mortality rate is quite high. So these are some of the quite interesting adaptations that seabirds have. Their plumage colors are quite different as well. You don't get these colorful plumages that you might see in some terrestrial birds. So their colour's almost always grey, black, brown, or white, and they do exhibit some counter shading, which is a technique for camouflaging, where the top of the bird will be dark, so anything looking down on it, it will remain dark against the ocean or the land, wherever it is. The underside will often be light, so any predators looking up will see a light body against a light background. And this is common across lots of animals. Quite a lot of fish have this as well. They have a really high density of feathers, and most seabird species have a waterproof lining, so they can get wet, they can get completely submerged, and it won't saturate their under feathers. A lot of them have salt glands, so they have these in the nasal slits, and it's a way to offload salt. So rather than excreting it in their urea, they can actually almost sweat it out of salt glands that are normally located just in front of the eyes on the bill. Pretty much all of them will have webbed feet for swimming. Some of them might be able to carry things in their feet as well, but for the most part, most seabirds have webbed feet to help with swimming. Most of them, again, have a really well-developed olfactory system, and they can smell, whether it's a decaying carcass or a plankton bloom, they can smell that from tens of kilometers away. And they're all really, really aerodynamic because of the high winds that you get in the marine environment. It's not uncommon to get 80, 90 kilometer-hour winds off our coasts, and they have to be able to fly and navigate in that. So they've all got very aerodynamic body shapes, and they're all very good flyers. I don't know if this will work. I'm going to play it and I'll see if it does work. But this is, apologies for the audio. But this is, for those of you that haven't been to a seabird colony, this is a seabird colony near me. So this is Elsa Craig in the Firth of Clyde. And just to illustrate the densities that some of these seabirds live in. So these are all gannets. And you can see that there's, sometimes 3 or 4 per square meter. So hopefully that worked. Apologies about the audio. It was coming out of my computer. But for those of you that haven't experienced the sensory onslaught, there's the seabird colony. There's plenty around the UK, but yeah, it's definitely worth a trip. So I'm going to go over some case studies. So it's just some interesting species that most of us might be aware of, and just tell you a little bit more about them. I'll start with my favorite seabird, that hopefully many of you will have seen. So this is the gannet. So this is one of the largest seabirds. It's actually the largest seabird we have, and their wingspan can get to 2 meters long. So really huge birds. And their method of feeding is to plunge dive. So they'll fly often up to 40 meters high, and they'll tuck their wings over, and they'll just pencil dive straight down, hitting the water really, really fast. They can fly huge distances. So in a single trip to forage for food, they can fly hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. And if anyone has seen these feeding out at sea, you'll know what I mean by they're just pretty awesome. I mean, it really is one of the nature spectacles to try and see. So their body shape's highly adapted to pierce the water. So if you look at the photo at the top of their head, their beak is like a spear. So they've got a spear-like bill that joins their head with almost no kind of demarcation. It doesn't rise up at the front like some birds, and that's so when it pierces the water, there's no part of the body that's taking a lot of the force. It pierces it like an arrow, and they can actually lock their neck muscles. So a little bit, I guess, like cogs. They can use the muscles. They've got spines on some of their vertebrae that when they tense their muscles, they're kind of almost makes their vertebrae pull together, so it locks it in place so that huge swan neck doesn't bend around. They've actually got nature's form of airbags as well. So they've got a sac, and they've got one kind of in their nasal cavity, and they've got some in their chest that they can inflate before they dive, and then when they hit the water, it forces the air out, and it acts like an airbag of a car or a crumple zone. They've got really good eyesight. So if you think about the conditions that gannets fly around in to look for food, they have to find fish below the surface of a rough ocean from tens of meters high, and they can modulate the shape of their lens. So whereas us, we only have one kind of type of focus. If you were to put glasses or contact lenses on, that changes the shape of your eye, and you can focus a bit further away, or they can modulate the shape of their lens. So they can bring the focus further away or closer, and that helps them spot the fish below the water. They also have this really weird third eyelid that slides across from the side, and that means that when they dive with their eyes open. It's kind of translucent. So we've got 2 eyelids, and they've got a third that comes across, and that means that they can keep their eyes open during diving, and it gives them a bit of protection. they've also got this, they don't have a stomach like us. They have different pouches in their stomach. So it's like a multi-compartmented stomach. So when they go on a big foraging trip, they could eat 10, 20 fish, and they can store them. And then if they get chased by something like a skua, or if they have to regurgitate, they don't regurgitate their whole stomach. They just regurgitate a small part of it. So they've got this branched kind of stomach bag. So that's that Gannets. Apologies if I'm rattling through this. I've picked out a load of species, and I'm slightly worried I won't have time for questions at the end, so I will rattle through these. We've got our fulmar. So these are one of the truest seabirds. They have all the characteristics that you'd expect. They spend almost their whole lives out at sea. They only come to land for a really small period in the breeding season, but they can be pelagic for years, like reaching breeding age. They look a little bit like a gull, but if you get up close, the flight pattern is different, the ecology is different. It's really just the coloring that makes them look like a gull. So these are a member of the Procellariform family, which basically includes the shearwaters and petrels. So if you look at the photo at the top, they do have that tube nose that we associate with albatrosses, and that gives them an extra effective olfactory system. So they can smell the oils that release from fish on the surface. They can also release this something called dimethyl sulfide. So it's this chemical that's often released from algae and plankton when it breaks down. It's like this sulfurous kind of oily smell. And they can detect that from 25 kilometers away. So they can detect an algal bloom with fish in a blank ocean 25 kilometers away. So they also have a really gross defense mechanism. And I don't know if any of you are rock climbers and if you've been climbing on some sea cliffs, but if so, you might be familiar with this. So they store this kind of oily substance in a little throat pouch, and the chicks in particular are really effective at vomiting this out. So if they feel threatened, they will projectile vomit this out, and it's this putrid, bright orange, oily, sticky substance. Stinks. I've been hit by it a few times. Not nice. But the purpose of it, other than just kind of to scare something away, is it can mat feathers. So it's because it's sticky and it's oily. Things like ravens, eagles, birds that might want to prey on it, it mats their feathers and inhibits their flying ability. And it's not uncommon below a sea cliff that has a load of fulmars for you to find carcasses of things like ravens that might be predating on them, because one spew of this, if it fully covers the bird, can completely inhibit that bird's flight. They can feed on a variety of different things, and in recent years, with the expansion of our fishing fleet, some populations of fulmars have actually become quite reliant on discards, which then poses the conservation question about, if we get rid of discards, what will happen to these populations of fulmars. We've now got a puffin, and I couldn't do a talk on birds without a puffin. So it's the closest thing we have in the northern hemisphere to a penguin. So they're really small. They fill that ecological niche that penguins do in the southern hemisphere. Unfortunately, much of them, I say much of them, I mean, some populations in Iceland seem to be okay, but the ones for most of northwestern Europe seem to be not doing so great. And I can talk about that at the end when we talk about the threats. So their beak is amazing. It serves a whole variety of biological purposes. The underneath of it has spines that point backwards. I don't know if anyone's seen in the inside of a turtle's beak, but essentially they've got a rough tongue and the serrated top of the beak. So every time they catch a fish, they use their tongue to clamp it up to the roof of their mouth and then slide it backwards so there's space for the rest. And that's how they'll feed. Everyone sees the puffins with the two beaks, the bottom half and the top half closed, and assume that that's how they hold them, but it's actually the tongue that jams it up to the roof of the mouth, and that's how they can open their mouth and get more fish. That beak is designed to reflect UV light. So a lot of people have produced really nice photos where you shine UV lights at puffins, and you can see it reflect off the beaks, and that's essentially for attracting a mate. It's a show of fitness. So they've got this counter shaded body as well, so that's really useful, especially because they're small and they're predated on quite a lot. They do have this black and white kind of counter shading, and puffins are actually flightless for a whole month out at sea. So they shed all their primaries all in one go, unlike some birds that shed one or two, and they basically maintain flight for their shedding period. But puffins shed them all in one go. So in the winter, just after the breeding season, they are flightless, so they bob around at sea for a whole month and can't fly. They make burrows. They can either make their own burrows or they excavate, things like rabbit burrows. And their typical strategy is one parent will go off to forage and the other one will stand and trot around outside the burrow and guard it, either from predators or so another puffin doesn't come and steal the burrow. So they're quite comical on land if you ever get to see them outside the burrows. So we've got a Manx shearwater. So this is the ocean voyager. So over a Manx shearwater's lifetime, it can travel to the moon 3 times. It flies that far, and it's because they migrate 20,000 kilometers a year, and they can live for up to 50 years. So that ends up with a huge amount of distance traveled. They're on the wing almost the whole time when they're migrating. So they have a very effortless flight. They tend to bank rather than flap. They have really good vision, just like gannets. They can detect prey below the surface, and they also have quite good vision in the dark as well. So for anyone that knows Manx shearwaters and have been to a colony, they only fly to their burrows after dark. So they need this kind of good vision at night to be able to find the entrance to their burrows. And they can also use smell for this as well. They absolutely stuff their chicks. So Manx shearwater chicks, when they leave the nest, are a third bigger than their parents. So a third heavier than their parents. So they absolutely gorge their chicks, and that is a fat chick. They used to be quite commonly eaten in areas around the west coast of Scotland. We're also not quite sure how they navigate. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they can detect the Earth's magnetic field, but we're not quite sure how. There's been studies that have shown they've got magnetite crystals around the eyes, and that somehow that can help them kind of align with the Earth's magnetic field. But it's a quite kind of poorly understood field. We've got our shags. So these are kind of more fish than bird. One of the only seabirds that don't have waterproof feathers. So shags only have partially waterproof feathers, and it means that they take on water. So if you ever watch a shag swimming, it doesn't swim on top of the water like a gannet or a gull. It kind of, its body is mostly below the water and just its head, and that's because its feathers take on water rather than repel it. And that's so when it's diving, it doesn't have this kind of life jacket. You know, every bird that has a waterproof feather layer, they trap a layer of air, and that's really useful because it keeps you buoyant, but it also stops you diving and swimming efficiently. So that's often why you see shags and cormorants kind of sat on a rock drying their wings. They're quite good divers. They can dive to over 40 meters deep. They can't hold their breath for that long, but I mean 45 seconds is pretty good for a bird. And they use their good swimming skills. They're pursuit predators, so they'll chase their prey, often flatfish, eels, things like that. They normally hunt solo, but occasionally you come into a little narrow bay and you'll see a whole bunch of shags swimming into the bay. And so they have been observed herding fish together. And we're not sure if this is, if this is organized or if this is just there's lots of shags in the area. They're all trying to get the fish, and they just happen to herd it in. But you do see this herding behavior where a whole group of shags enter a small bay and shoal the fish in. So these are the last ones I'm going to talk about. I'm sorry to end on gulls. Some people think these are pests, but they're amazing creatures from a biological point of view. So they are in every continent. They inhabit every single habitat. You find them in the city. You find them in the hills. You find them open ocean, farmland. You find them everywhere. And they are nature's cleaner. So they remove food waste. They're really, really good scavengers. And they're crazy intelligent. So the amount of information they're able to convey, they're so adaptive when they're foraging. They can have all sorts of calls that signify foods here or dangers here, or who found that food first and the others must wait. And they've got all sorts of calls that are to do with organizing their feeding. And they can have quite cooperative behavior whilst feeding as well. They're able to unhinge their jaws. So I've seen a great blackback gull swallow a whole horse mackerel, a huge fish, bigger than we'd be able to eat for dinner. And I've seen them swallow it whole. So they've got this amazing bill that they can unhinge and swallow stuff. And it's also a generalist bill. So it's kind of designed a bit for fishing, a bit for scavenging, a bit for fighting. And they've got, so you often see a seagull stand on one leg. Their heat exchange system works through their legs. So a lot of people watch Frozen Planet and they wonder how that seagull is able to stand on ice with a leg. And essentially they lift one up, they stand on one leg, and they've got this vein exchange system. So their veins and arteries wrap around each other. And it means that incoming blood from a cold foot passes through hot blood before it goes back to the organs, back to the heart. So it means the legs kind of stay cold. They've not got a really hot leg like us standing on the ice. They basically, the leg remains external temperature and their internal temperature remains hot. So it's a really cool kind of circulatory exchange system they have called the rete mirabile. So that's seabirds. Apologies I couldn't cover more. On the seabirds course, I think some of you Ian and Helen might have seen, I go through a whole host of species, but I've got to move on to marine mammals or I run out of time. I've thrown an otter up here because people are always angry at me that I don't include otters in the marine mammals. If I had time, I probably would, but otters are kind of this weird one. We don't have sea otters, we have otters that live in the sea. So some of our otters are marine specialists, but it's up for debate whether we'd include them as marine mammals. Because they're sufficiently different to the other marine mammals in terms of life history and ecology, I tend to not include them. So the problem with marine mammals is, and the reason why we don't know a lot about them is because they're incredibly hard to study. So they're highly mobile, they travel huge distances, and they're cryptic. So they're well camouflaged, and because of the nature of where they live and where we live, we get a flash of a couple of seconds at the surface, and they spend most of their lives under the ocean. They also inhabit really remote and quite inhospitable areas for us for most of the time. So again, really difficult to get around them. They're hugely popular. They're always the most kind of talked about or most desirable kind of species to see on a wildlife trip or something. But they're really, really understudied. And some of the more rare species we only know from strandings. So we only know from carcasses that we've found, what they look like. Some of them have only been seen a few times in real life. Some of the beaked whales. So some common kind of adaptations they have, all of them, with no exceptions, have really, really good hearing. Cetaceans more than seals. So by cetaceans, I mean whales, dolphins, and porpoise. But seals do have good hearing too. But cetaceans in particular, they will echolocate to get around. So just like a bat, they will produce sound that bounces off objects and comes back to them. So that will normally be done with a clicking. So they have I guess where our nostrils would be, they obviously come out at the top of the head. They have this muscular valve that they can kind of force air through it really quickly, and that makes this clicking noise. And that clicking, a little bit like a bat, is how they navigate, because they spend most of their lives completely in darkness. They also produce vocalizations, so whistles, moans, grunts. So they're the two sounds that they use. They're really deep divers, or they're really good divers. Some of them can dive up to some of the beaked whales can dive up to 4 kilometers deep. And the pressure, that would crush a tin can in a split second. So it's ridiculously inhospitable, the areas they spend their lives. And again, some of the beaked whales can hold their breath for over 2 hours. They're almost all pursuit predators. And as a result, they all swim pretty fast. Some of the fastest ones, things like common dolphin or sei whales, can swim 30, 40 miles an hour for extended distances. So again, some of the common ones that we've got across the UK. So we've got our harbour porpoise. Now this is common. It doesn't matter where you live in the UK. There will be porpoise off the coast, more than likely. There might be lower densities or higher densities, but you will pretty much get porpoise all across the North Sea and all around the UK coastline. They're the smallest cetacean we have, so they're only about 1.5 meters long when they're adult. This is a photo of one that was stranded that we rescued from the beach. That's a juvenile, but just to show you, I've eaten fish that are bigger than that. So that's how big a juvenile porpoise is. And they're the most numerous cetacean we have as well. So there's hundreds of thousands. I think there's 380 or 400,000 harbour porpoise in UK waters, or in the population unit that the UK waters make up. Now, these are one of the primary species of concern for EIA, so environmental impact assessments for offshore industries, because there's so many of them. They're quite vulnerable. So they're predated on by lots of animals, and they'll be predated on by killer whales. They'll be attacked by bottlenose dolphins. The leading cause of death in Scotland for porpoise is bottlenose dolphin attack. And they're highly sensitive to underwater noise. So as a result, they're often they're kind of the proxy species that people focus their EIAs on for offshore industries. Because they're really small, low body mass, and they live in a cold environment. They have a really, really fast metabolism. They basically must feed constantly, day and night. Unlike some whales will feed for a season and then go to breed and won't eat for 3-4 months. Porpoise are the exact opposite. They have to feed continually, and they eat enough fish and they burn through so many calories that every day they replace 10% of their kind of body mass in calories. That's how much they have to eat. Usually live in small groups, but we do have some large aggregations that we're seeing in Scotland now, off Orkney and Shetland, huge aggregations of hundreds of porpoise, and we don't really know why. Possibly breeding, possibly socializing, possibly it's just really good feeding. But there's a PhD student at the moment studying that in Scotland to figure out why these porpoise live solitary for most of their lives, but then come together in these high density shoals. So we've got the killer whale straight on from the most vulnerable to possibly the the least vulnerable. So they're fairly common in North and West Scotland. You do get them in the kind of northeast coast of the UK. You get them in Cornwall and Wales every now and again, but really the bulk of the UK's killer whales are in Scotland. We have two populations. There's a really small resident population that cruises around the west coast. So they're kind of resident to the Western Isles and the Hebrides. There's only 8 of them left ish, and they haven't had a calf in 25 years. So that population is kind of functionally extinct almost. There's only 8 adults left, and they're not reproducing. So that population, unfortunately, will die out. They're the only resident population we have. So it's really, really sad. We know quite a lot about this population because they've been around for a while. And SMAS, so the Scottish Marine Animal Stranding Scheme, have taken lots of samples over the years to try and figure out why they might not be reproducing. The other population comes over from Iceland, and it kind of in April, May, June, it kind of migrates into Scottish waters, and they're the ones that come down the kind of east coast, down through Aberdeenshire, occasionally go as far as Firth of Forth. So they're the two populations. They've got an incredibly complex social structure. They live in these matrilineal societies where they have a matriarch, so they have a large female, an adult female who leads the pack. They form really close bonds with their at least the females do. The males often kind of split off and join another pod, but the females tend to stick with their mother for their whole lives. There's a lot of shared learning, so hunting strategies, complex behaviors that are passed down, and because of this shared learning and the close proximity that they stay with that for their whole lives, they have different dialects between populations. So even though they produce the same kind of sounds, a little bit like humpback whales, 2 killer whales from different parts of the world probably wouldn't understand each other. And we don't know a lot about their vocalizations, but we do know that they're different between populations. They have a huge brain relative to their body size, which has resulted in all of these complex hunting strategies that I'm sure you've seen on Frozen Planet or Blue Planet. They're ambush predators. They can shoal, or they can herd together like a pack of wolves. They're even smart enough that when they're hunting some species that have good hearing, they will not produce any sounds. So they do this thing called passive listening, where they don't produce any of their own sounds, and they basically just wait for the prey to make a noise and then navigate using that. They've also figured out, some of them, how to interact with fisheries. So I watched a video just today of a fisherman off Orkney, with a killer whale around his fishing net, and he was chucking fish in. So a lot of them have learned that they can get prey from fisheries. The photo at the top is from when they came into the Firth of Clyde, where I live. So that's a huge Navy boat behind them. A big pod swam into the Firth of Clyde right in the middle of Operation Joint Warrior, which is the largest naval military exercise we have. So on top of the helicopters, planes, and destroyers and submarines, you've then got these killer whales that have been attracted, probably because of all this noise and chaos. They've kind of come in to find out what's going on. They can eat pretty much anything they can catch: porpoise, seals, fish, anything that they can catch, they eat. And prey seems to be plentiful for them. They certainly don't seem strapped for food. We've got our bottlenose dolphins. So again, another really charismatic species that a lot of people have seen or want to see. We actually have 5 resident populations of bottlenose dolphins in the UK. So we've got a Western Isles and a Hebrides group on the west coast of Scotland. We've got the East Coast Moray Firth population in Scotland, and they're protected with an SAC. They're actually the only resident bottlenose dolphin population in the North Sea, those ones in Scotland. And I work quite extensively with those in my work with the government, and we deploy acoustic monitoring equipment off the east coast of Scotland, and we hope to kind of capture their vocalizations and investigate if there's been any distribution shifts or impacts from the wind turbines that have been built in Scotland over the last 10 years. They're pretty commonly sighted because they predominantly have a coastal distribution. You do get these offshore ecotypes, so these pods of bottlenose dolphins that aren't resident to a coastline, and you see those far out at sea. But we don't know a lot about them, but they are genetically different to the ones that we have inshore. Same species, but they are different populations. There's not a huge amount of mixing. They tend to seek out interactions with humans and other animals. They'll seek out other mammals to play with. They'll seek out boats. So you'll often see them bow riding. So they're one of the coolest things to see, I think, at sea is some bottlenose dolphins, just because they're one of the few that seem to want you there or seem to be happy you're there rather than just kind of, going off and doing what they do. Some of them are specialists, so some of them predate. Some of them, for example, the ones in the Moray Firth, some of them are salmon specialists, so they wait at the mouth of rivers in the estuary, and they wait for an outgoing tide, and they pretty much just pick off the salmon as they're flooded out on the outgoing tide. But they are pretty generalists, and they can feed on a whole bunch of different fish species. They're quite aggressive. Not a lot of people think bottlenose dolphins are all kind of happy and splashy and friendly, but they're pretty aggressive. So as I said before, the leading cause of death for porpoises in Scotland is bottlenose dolphin attack, and they'll ram them and break their ribs. They'll grab them by the flipper and toss them around, and they'll even punt them kind of out into the air. You might have seen killer whales do it with some species. We're not really sure why. There's two hypotheses. One is there's three. One is that they do it for the crack. They find it fun. Another one is they see them as a kind of threat to their prey resource. So they see them as a kind of competitor. And the other theory, the third theory, is that actually they practice infanticide in their own species. So they might try and kill bottlenose dolphin calves, to reduce, especially male to male, reduce competition, and to get females. And they might confuse a porpoise with a baby dolphin. So that's the kind of third one. None of these are proven. We're not quite sure why they do this, but it's not a rare thing. It happens quite a lot in Scotland. Okay, I'm sorry, there's been a bit. There we go. Sperm whales are up. So this is the largest predator on planet Earth, or the largest kind of predator as we typically think about it. You've got blue whales and other whales that are bigger, but they're often filter feeders. They're not pursuit predators. So this is the largest, certainly the largest tooth predator on the planet. And the UK has the highest number of sperm whale sightings in Northern Europe. So it's a great place to see them. Unfortunately, they're extreme deep divers, and they don't come close to land. And when they do, it normally means something's wrong. So over the last couple of years, we've seen lots in the North Sea, for example. There's been sperm whales washing up all over the place or sighted off the coast. That's normally not a great sign. That normally means something's gone wrong with their navigation, or they're potentially compromised and they've got poor body condition or something. But they're massive. The males can reach up to 20 meters. The females are a bit smaller, and they spend most of their time diving. So they spend most of their time in complete darkness. They can dive to over 3 kilometers, and they can stay there for an hour and a half. So surveying and researching sperm whales is really tricky, because they'll be up for 10, 20 minutes at a time, and then they'll be down for the next hour and a half. So it's really tricky to study them. They're one of the few marine mammals that don't produce vocalizations. They only produce these echolocation clicks, but they use those for communicating and for navigating. So they don't whistle, they don't moan. They only produce clicks, and they produce clicks in a series of patterns. There's pretty much Morse code. It's analogous to Morse code. So they'll have their echolocation ones for searching and finding prey, but then also have specific patterns of clicks that they'll use to communicate over really, really vast distances with other sperm whales. Their main prey is squid, so they have to dive fairly deep down for the squid. And there's some evidence to suggest that their echolocation is so powerful that they can use their stuns at close range to stun their prey, so to stun a squid and kind of temporarily kind of paralyze it before eating it. But all of this occurs really, really deep down. I mean, it's something we're never going to catch on video. It's something we have to infer from acoustic data or from kind of squid that we've recovered in areas adjacent to sperm whales. So it's really hard to figure out some of their life history characteristics. And we've got our 2 seals in the UK. So we've got our grey seals and we've got our harbour seals. So there we do get other visitors. We do get, we've had walruses and stuff, but these are our 2 resident seals. Grey seals, much bigger. They've got this long. So I tried to put a couple of photos up to help you differentiate. And I've just realized only now that I've put the heads on the wrong ones. So apologies. The little circle on the right is the grey seal's head, and the one on the left is the harbour seal's head. That was me throwing this together an hour ago. So grey seals, much bigger. They've got bigger splodges, so bigger patches. They've got this long kind of, they call it a bit of a Roman nose, this long snout. Harbour seals, much smaller, tend to be more speckly than splodgy, and they have a much kind of cuter, almost cat-like face. So the way I tend to think of it is horses have more of like a dog horse face, and harbour seals have more of like a cat face. we have loads of grey seals in the UK. We have 40% of the world's grey seals in the UK, and they're pretty well distributed. You get them in the Wash, you get them in Wales, you get them in the Channel, you get them all the way up the east coast of the North Sea. We get them in the Hebrides. The harbour seal, we have a fair few of them. But harbour seals are, I guess, more globally distributed. So you get harbour seals all the way across the Atlantic. We mostly get harbour seals in the UK and North and West Scotland. There are isolated kind of small populations scattered around, but for the most part, they're in the north and west of Scotland. And grey seals are doing really well. Most populations of grey seals are increasing quite dramatically. Harbour seals, unfortunately, some populations are showing the opposite. So it's varied. The harbour seals on the west coast of Scotland, for example, seem to be doing quite well. The harbour seals on the east coast of Scotland and along the north coast of Scotland and Orkney have experienced dramatic declines and haven't recovered. So there's a big work package actually that the Scottish Government commission every year to try and ascertain why some populations are declining and why some populations aren't. There's a lot of hypotheses. It's predation by grey seals and killer whales, competition for prey, contaminants, pollutants. There's quite a lot of hypotheses, and we're just kind of working through those at the moment. There's a couple we can rule out, but nothing that we've been able to pin it on. So lastly, I'll talk about fish. I'm actually going to talk about one fish. I did think about talking about others, but I was worried about time. So we've got our basking shark, the second largest fish on the planet, definitely the largest fish we get in UK waters. And these are huge. So they can be up to 10 meters long, the size of a whale. They visit the UK every year. Typically, they arrive on the south coast a bit earlier, so you'll find them kind of sometimes in Cornwall and up the west coast of Wales, April, kind of June time. But in Scotland, July, August, September is where we get them, and they're mainly around the west coast in the Hebrides, but we are seeing quite a few in recent years over on the east coast in the Moray Firth. These were fished for quite a while, up until 1994, so I actually know someone who is related to the last person that fished basking sharks commercially, and so we fished them up to 1994, and it stopped just out my window in the Firth of Clyde. That was the kind of last fishery for them. They're protected now. And they are recovering, and we do seem to be seeing more of them. They were fished for their liver oil predominantly. It was used to lubricate aviation equipment, for perfumes, for engineering. So that was the valuable part, and they did try and make other parts of the fish sellable, like they tried to use the skin for leather handbags and meat for fish meal, but it was pretty much the liver that they were after. So because of the low density of prey they encounter, they filter feed plankton, but because each plankton is very small and contains not very many calories, they have to pretty much feed constantly throughout the summer to gain enough energy, and as a result they have the lowest metabolic rate of any shark species. So they really just are almost on autopilot. They don't have a huge amount of energy to spend, hence why they move so slowly. They can filter a huge amount of water, 500 tons of water they can filter through their gill rakers, which you can see on the inside, per hour, and they're really good at finding high density patches of plankton rich oceans. So they can find, they don't just cruise through the oceans with their mouths open. They can find out the areas of high density plankton, and that's why they arrive on our shores in summer when the plankton blooms. A huge part of the life cycle is still a mystery. We don't really know where they go and what they do. We know they often go offshore in winter. We know they go down deep. Some of them stick around. There doesn't seem to be any patterns. We don't really know what their breeding strategies are. We don't really know their mating strategies. There's a whole kind of part of a basking shark's life that we just don't fully understand, because we only see them for a couple of months in a year doing a very specific, they're here for the food. We don't really know what they do for the rest of the year. So I'm going to move on. For the last kind of bit of the presentation, I just hope to talk more generally. So hopefully I've talked about some kind of cool case studies and maybe some species that people were hoping to learn more about. But for the last one, I wanted to talk about some of the threats they face, and then I'll finish off by talking about how you can get involved. So there's a huge variety of threats to marine predators. These are all the things that that marine mammals and seabirds might have to put up with. So one of the big ones is fisheries. So this could be bycatch, or I guess for things like fish, it's probably if we're counting fish as marine megafauna, it probably wouldn't be bycatch, it would just be catch. But for the most part, marine mammals and seabirds that get caught in fish gear are bycatch. They're not intended to be caught. And there's quite a few methods that are hazardous to them. So things like drift nets are pretty much hazardous to anything. They're just these huge nets that drift along the ocean and snag up everything that's in there. Long lines, so they're a series of baited hooks. They can attract predators and be really hazardous to them. We have a lot of entanglement in Scotland in creel pots. So usually baleen whales, but we've also seen seals entangled in creel gear. So yeah, bycatch in general, whether it's deliberate or whether it's actively fished or static, bycatch in fisheries gear is quite a big problem. Obviously, there's competition with fisheries as well. You know, we're fishing for fish; they're hoping to hunt for fish. So certain key fish stocks are really where you see this, and it affects more specialist predators than generalists. So for things like kittiwakes, for things like puffins, for things like harbour seals or harbour porpoise. So the species that generally predate on sand eels and are quite specialist for predating on sand eels, these are the ones that are currently experiencing some issues in the North Sea with the sand eel fishery. We've also got discards and the dependence that particularly some seabirds can have on discards from fishing vessels. We've got pollution. So contaminants can come from a whole range of different sources. So we can get runoff from farms. We can have antifoulants that are painted on boats, oil spills, sewage leaks. Of particular importance for apex predators are POPs, which are persistent organic pollutants, and PCBs, which is polychlorinated brominol. I forget what the last bit in PCB is. They're essentially these complex chemicals that persist in the marine environment, and we've also got heavy metals as well. So because of their life history strategies, you know, a small fish might take on a bit of chemical from the food chain. That'll get eaten by a larger fish. That large fish will eat 10 fish in a day or whatever. As you go up the food chain, these POPs and PCBs can bioaccumulate. So when you get to something like an apex predator, they can have orders of magnitude higher contaminants than the water around them and the prey around them. So I don't know if anyone remembers, the top picture is Lulu, which is a killer whale that washed ashore in Scotland about 10 years ago. And when that carcass was analysed, the levels of contaminants in that carcass would have ordinarily classed it as hazardous waste. So the concentration of things like heavy metals and PCBs in the blubber was so high that it was essentially classed as toxic waste. So it's not just chemical pollutants, though. We also have litter. So we have microplastics, which can bioaccumulate up in the food chain again, or we have the macroplastics, which can either get stuck and cause problems with ingestion, or they can get entangled. So we've got a kind of range of pollution. I can also throw noise pollution, I guess, into that one as well. We've got habitat loss. So there could be areas for feeding, breeding. Any area that they can't use anymore is lost. We've got disturbance. For birds, this can be anything, but for marine mammals, it's primarily disturbance from underwater noise because they've got this really sensitive hearing. We can have direct mortality. So we can have collisions with vessels, tidal turbines, wind turbines, and lethal takes. So some deliberate mortality. So, you know, whether it's a license to shoot a seal that's predating salmon in a declining river, or various kind of culls that aren't very popular with the public, and as such, we you know, the UK hasn't seen them in a while, but you know, these are potential sources or have been past sources of mortality. And then we've got climate change. So overlying all the other threats that they have to deal with, we've got for birds, increased frequency and severity of winter storms can mean that juveniles or birds that are in poor body condition can get swept off ledges or they can drown. Climate change can also impact their prey availability, so both in space and time. So prey might be in a different area at a different time of the year. There might be more of them or less of them. Their spawning might have shifted either spatially or temporally. And then we've got potential disruptions to ocean circulation and ocean currents, and we don't really know what impact this might have. I mean, it will obviously have some impact on their prey. It might also impact migration routes. It might also mean we have new species coming in or species leaving. So why I've got seabirds as indicators, but you know, this can be extrapolated to all. So because they're apex predators, any change in the trophic structure, so any change in the food web below them, will manifest itself in changes in the marine mammal or the seabird populations. So in the short term, so these are all things that we can have a look at and monitor in seabirds and marine mammals that will tell us something about the ecosystem health. So by researching seabirds and marine mammals, you're not just collecting data on them, you can infer lots of different things about the ecosystem. So we could look at their diet, we could look at their pathologies, so the injuries or the diseases they have, or we could look at their behavior. So that can tell us some things in the short term about the food web below. In the long term, we can look at their reproductive success. Tricky word. We can have a look at their abundance or their distribution. And again, any changes in that might tell us what's going on for the rest of the ecosystem. So for the last bit, I want to talk about quickly how to get involved. And I know I'm tight for time. So my biggest kind of recommendation is to volunteer. Marine Life and Orca train you up, and you go on ferries, vessels, freighters, tankers all across the UK to collect at-sea survey data from marine mammals and seabirds. So they're a good one to get in touch with. The RSPB and the Wildlife Trust will have reserves that you can go and volunteer at, or you can go along to an open day or something. If anyone's more interested in getting involved with stranded animals, then British Divers Marine Life Rescue, they do a marine mammal medic course. They will train you up on how to provide kind of palliative care or rescue for marine mammals that have washed up. If any of you want field courses, both field or online, I think we've already talked about it, but the Field Studies Council is an excellent one. They do courses in absolutely everything, both online and in person, all across the UK. And there's often citizen science projects. These are kind of tend to come and go, so I don't have any that I'm aware of at the moment, but in the past, there's things like there's Whale and Dolphin Watch, which is something that Sea Watch organization do. So every year on the same week, they try and get as many people out on headlands, counting and IDing marine mammals, which can be really valuable information. So there's lots of different citizen science projects that you guys could get involved with. A little bit on where to find them, I'm sure you all know, but essentially get out into the ocean as much as you can possible. Headlands, islands, sounds where the water's enclosed by all sides on land. Tidal races. If you can get yourself on ferries or get down to harbours or sea cliffs, these are the best places to find marine mammals and seabirds. But in particular, get out on a boat. You won't regret it. Particularly ferries on the west coast of Scotland. It's almost a free whale watching trip sometimes. Okay, I think I don't know if I'm over or under time because I did want to leave some time for questions, but apologies for rattling through. I really didn't want to overrun the time because I know I think I've been told that there's some questions that are waiting for me. So I'll just stop sharing my screen so you can see me.
Thanks, Jack. Perfect timing, I would say.
Oh.
Covered an awful lot of ground there, but done it very clearly and thoroughly. So thank you for that.
No, can you still see my screen, or have I managed to successly stop?
You've managed to stop sharing, although it did have your contact details on. So if people wanted those, it may be worth leaving it up.
I'll stick them in the chat while we have some.
Thank you. So yes, we do have a few questions already. If people have others, please put them in the Q&A. One just to clarify. At one point, I think you said when you were describing orcas, you talked about them being least vulnerable, but also the West Coast population being very vulnerable. Was that a sort of global versus local perspective? Yeah,
that's a really good point. I guess by vulnerable, I was thinking predation and because they're big bad beasties. But you're right. The West Coast population. I mean, I think it's past the point where it's vulnerable now. It's functionally extinct. But we're not quite sure the reasons for those declines either. We think it's something to do with their physiology. So it's something potentially to do with contaminants or something. But yeah, killer whales tend to vary in terms of their success between different populations. So there's ones on the northwest coast of North America that are doing very, very poorly, and the population just adjacent to them to the north seems to be doing pretty well. So the north and south resident killer whales you might have heard. So yeah, in general, because they are generalists and they have a quite general diet, they can buffer a lot of changes. If one prey fizzles out, they can start preying on another. But yeah, it's quite different depending on each group of killer whales, and I guess due to the differences in their culture and learning.
Thank you. Just staying with orca, you mentioned probably the more sort of Norwegian population coming down the east coast during the summer. Would that have been the likely population source for the one that was off Yorkshire in September?
Yes, and because orca, there's not many of them, and they tend to be quite big and charismatic, and people take lots of photos of them. We know a lot of the individual orcas, so we can use photo identification, the same with kind of bottlenose dolphins, so to match these individuals. So more than likely, if the ones that got seen off Yorkshire, if there was any semi-decent photos of them, I'm sure they've been submitted, or I'm sure the scientists responsible have found them. But yeah, they will have been identified to and sometimes, you know, you can identify it to a pod. So I imagine, I didn't look into it, so I'm not sure, but yeah, they essentially go round the north coast of Scotland into the Moray Firth and then down the Aberdeenshire coast, searching for food, pretty much. So yes, they definitely wouldn't have been the West Coast population. So they will likely be the Scandinavian, Icelandic population that come down in spring.
And similarly, the dolphins, the bottlenose dolphins that have been off the Yorkshire coast a lot, would probably be the Moray population coming south.
Yeah, so since the 90s, so I work a lot on these dolphins. I actually did my master's thesis on that population of dolphins, and traditionally, or typically, they were mostly seen in the Moray Firth up north, and there's been a bit of a range expansion in the last 10-20 years where they've been roaming much further down south, so their range for their population has expanded, and it's now really, really common to see them in the Forth and Tay. It's really common to see them in the borders, and yep, you're getting them down into Northumberland and Yorkshire, and even occasionally they go further afield. You know, they've been sighted in Ireland or the Firth of Clyde. But yeah, that population is doing so well that their range is expanded. So people that live in Yorkshire and have looked at the coastlines their whole lives, you potentially might be seeing more bottlenose dolphins in future if they carry on this range expansion.
It does seem that way. They're a lot more prevalent than they were 5 or 10 years ago, but who knows?
Yeah, I think only 50% of the SAC population actually stay in the SAC now, which means half of the population range down the British coastline down the east.
Thank you. Turning to sand eels that you mentioned as well, and sort of change in distribution. Are there studies looking at perhaps impact of sea temperatures or other reasons for their change in population distribution?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because the sand eel population are essentially being hit by two different things. The first is climate change. So the difference in temperature can affect their spawning. So sand eels, they've not had a great few years for spawning, but essentially, if the conditions are warmer, they might spawn earlier or later, and that can have knock-on impacts for the animals that predate on them. So, you know, the seabird breeding season, you know, they all flock to the colonies. You know, they're ready to breed. If the spawning of their key prey is now at a different time of the year or slightly later, that can throw off and can really impact things like puffins and kittiwakes. So you get this mismatch in time and space between when the sand eels spawn and where the seabirds, you know, breed and are hoping to fledge their chicks. So you've got impacts of climate change, which are messing with the spawning behavior, but you've also got overfishing. So you've also got you know, huge fishing fleets in the North Sea that hoover up sand eels, mostly for fish meal and for livestock feed. So it'll mostly go to feed for salmon farms and fish farms, or for livestock like pig feed. So you've got the environmental impacts of climate change coupled with depletions by fishing fleets. There's actually a consultation out at the moment to close parts of the North Sea to sand eel fishing. So nothing's been decided yet, but it's recognised as not just a benefit to seabirds and marine mammals, but a wider ecosystem benefit because of how important sand eels are for so many different species.
Thank you. Turning then to Atlantic salmon, also on the decline. Are there known factors around that, or is that still active research?
So in Scotland, it tends to be specific. So I guess the overall picture is a decline, but it's very river specific. So some salmon rivers in Scotland, for example, are in very poor conservation status. Some of them not so much. And I work with a whole bunch of diadromous fish scientists in marine Scotland, who are every year they deploy these trackers. So they catch smolts when they're in the river. So when the smolts leave the rivers, they catch them and they implant these little tags. They surgically implant these little kind of tracker tags that have to go past a receiver to be detected. And so they will plant those in different rivers, and then they will go out to where the rivers, you know, enter the ocean, and they'll make these huge arrays of detectors in a big semicircle to figure out where these fish are going. Because one of the main questions we want to answer is, we don't know where these fish go when they leave the river. Therefore, we don't know if it's impacts whilst they're at sea. We don't know if it's impacts in the river. So a large part of my team's work in Marine Scotland is to try and figure out, where do these salmon go when they leave the river? And that can help us, you know, if we see they're all going right through a wind farm, or if we see they're all going right through an area that's, you know, historically fished a lot, that can help us try and find out why the decline is happening, and where in their life cycle the impacts are happening. You know, is it in the rivers or is it in the ocean?
And the last one, Simon has just snuck in under the wire with a really cute question, and I don't know if this puts you on the spot too much. How come we can track a salmon but not a basking shark?
It's a really good question. So so the tags that we put in salmon, they're not GPS tags. They can't ping. They have to go near our detector. So basically, we have a big bit of equipment that listens for any tags that come past. So that salmon will have to swim within probably less than 100 meters of that that tag to pick up. So if we don't tag the fish, we don't find out where they go. So it's a kind of, you know, you have to put the tags in the fish, and you have to rely on them swimming past your detector. We have picked up basking sharks on our array, because some people have put this type of tag on a basking shark, and we've picked it up. But because with the fish, we can isolate them in the river. You know, we can catch a load of smolts and we can put tags in fish. Really hard to put tags on a basking shark. Possible, but hard. We also then have to target all of our receivers around the mouth. We couldn't just scatter them all out to sea. We have to almost put them in like a barrier, put them in a blockade. So wherever the fish leaves, it has to swim past a detector. The tags we can put on basking sharks, we can put satellite tracking tags on basking sharks. The problem is satellite tags don't work underwater very well. The minute you go a couple of meters down, they can't communicate with a satellite. So you pretty much have two options. You can have a tag that only communicates when it's at the surface. So the minute it breaks the surface, it communicates with a satellite and it tells you where it is. That's really good for basking sharks in the summer when they're at the surface. Pretty useless in winter when they go down deep. The other one that we can have is an archival tag that collects the data. So rather than pinging from a satellite and the satellite telling you where it is, it gets its location from satellites, but it keeps the data on it. But unfortunately, we have to get these tags back to download the data. They're archival rather than transmission. And the difficulties with getting some of these tags back when the basking sharks leave, you know, they go offshore in deeper waters. So it's not impossible to tag a basking shark. But it has been done. But I guess just to differentiate, the tags we put in fish kind of work with the detectors, whereas the tags we put on the basking sharks, they're kind of slightly different. It's a good question though.
Well, that's a fantastic response, Jack. And just, you know, what could have been quite a tricky question, you've obviously got massive in-depth knowledge. So thank you for that. Yeah. I think we're pretty much out of time. So I would just say thank you very much personally before I hand back to Helen, and wish you luck with all your advice and work to protect the marine environment. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for having me. I think that's one of the first ones that I've kept to time. So thank you very much. I've put my email in the chat. If anyone does have any questions, feel free to email. I think this talk arose from Ian coming on a course and emailing me when I put it in the end. So thank you so much for having me. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jack. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you here. What a fantastic information-packed talk that was. I thought I knew a lot about seabirds, but apparently not. There's still an awful lot to learn. I mean, the thing about fulmars being able to detect an algal bloom at 25 kilometers is just completely astonishing, isn't it? How can that be? And I love it that there are still mysteries as well, you know, like the shear waters and their detection of a magnetic field, but nobody really quite knows how. It's marvelous that there's still all these things to find out. And the other thing that really struck me and surprised me was the size of the harbour porpoise. Tiny. What a tiny thing. Yeah. No, very interesting, and very, you know, these lovely surprising things that you discover in these sorts of wonderful talks. Of course, there's the more sobering message that comes at the end. These creatures are under a great deal of pressure. There's all kinds of threats. I detected that you would like to encourage as many people as possible, of course, to find out more about the threats, to find out more about the creatures, and generally play a bit of a role in starting to tackle or helping to tackle some of these problems that wildlife is facing in the seas.
I would just say on that, Helen, because that's a really good point, that I think there's not many times that you can kind of assist scientists in generating data that they couldn't get themselves. And for marine mammals in particular, because they're so scarce, so remote, so sporadic when they turn up. If people do see marine mammals, really do submit your photos. There's a whole bunch of websites. You can submit them on iRecord. You can go on Sea-Watch. And I think if anyone wants to collect data that would be valuable to scientists, I think watching marine mammals from headlands and submitting your sightings is really, really useful because of how little we know about them. So yeah, sorry, I just wanted to throw that in.
That's a great tip, Jack. That's a great tip, because I think, people are often left feeling a little bit helpless. What can I do? What can I do? But of course, that's one thing we can all do is submit our records of whatever kind. Before we finish, I'd just like to say, you may have seen on the slides that were going around at the start, there's a birding trip on Saturday. Sadly, I won't be able to go, but lots of you will be able to go. I think it's Nosterfield, David Smith. I'm sure it'll be a great trip. Oh, thank you, Jeff. And I think the next Wharfdale Nats meeting is live, and I think it's you, Jeff, isn't it? Yes, rewilding in Yorkshire and the work of the Yorkshire Rewilding Network. So those are two very exciting things to look forward to. I don't know. Do you want to add anything about the rewilding thing, Jeff?
I hope it will be half as good as Jack's. So I'm seeing people in Christchurch in 2 weeks.
Okay. Well, I can't say what I usually say, which is hope to see you next time, because I won't be there next time. But sometime in the not too distant future, hopefully, I will be in the same room as some of you again. And thanks again, Jack, for an absolutely wonderful tour. I think our audience will have been as wowed as I was by that wonderful and beautifully arranged information that you were able to give us. Thank you so much.
It took me more time to find the photos than it did to write the information, but that's the problem with having hard drives full of them.
Spoiled for choice. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. I think this has been recorded, so if anybody wants a second look or to go back more slowly through parts they didn't quite cover, then you'll be able to do that. Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye.